Oops, wrong thing. No. Now, where'd it go? Now, Amy? Where's Jackson?
Our screen
It's flashing.
is black. Yeah. But there it is.
Oh, there it is.
It was. It went
It
away.
was flashing before.
Okay, here, I can also just. Switch this to just be. There you go.
Thank you.
I think most of you all may have certainly know of Dr. Helms and Dr. Green and myself, but we actually had a much larger team working with us over the course of the year. We had Shola Shodaya Zamult, who is one of our junior associates, a graduate student at Georgia State University, Michelle Aiello, who is also a graduate student in counseling psychology at Georgia State, and Aman Saeed, who is a counseling psychology student at Georgia State University as well. So folks that I've worked with for some years in the Atlanta, Georgia area. We also welcomed Kendall Sanders, who is a psychology graduate, so graduate junior associate. In addition to that, our colleagues, Dr. Jet Page, Stephanie Thrower, Anmal Sathiani, and community conversations. And we asked individuals to sign up for those community conversations based on how they self-identified with regard to race, as either white identifying, non-Black people of color, or self-identifying as Black. And as was the case with, I think, many of the listening sessions that we hold, it was our goal to ensure that the facilitators of those groups identified in ways that were similar to the participants. So that was our full team over the course of the project. We also recognize that not everyone in the audience or that's participating today may have been privy to the information. Certainly for our core team, we met with the executive board, with cabinet, engaged with individuals across the division, but thought it would be good to just provide some additional context and a little bit of a timeline. So recognizing that the division in 2020, in September, the EB made an announcement with a commitment to identifying and addressing anti-Black racism within the division. On September 25th, the request for quotes or proposals was released in an effort to identify external consultants, which we responded to. We met with the selection committee from the division in early 2021. And actually that should be 2021 for April as well. So between April 29th and really June was a process that allowed us to begin starting with preliminary meetings with the cabinet, with the executive board, collecting some observational data, and also last year virtually meeting with individuals in the Liberation Lounge in an effort to introduce ourselves and our process. But we also utilized that opportunity to engage individuals and begin conversations about perceptions, observations, perspectives with regard to anti-Black racism. In the fall of 2021, we actually started officially phase one, behind the scenes mostly, which continued and led us to phase two, which we conducted in January about March of 2022, and led us to phase three, which sort of brings us to where we are currently. So prior to the official start of the APA conference this year, helped to facilitate the retreat led by Dr. Amy Reynolds with regard to the work groups that were identified in an effort to participate in a task to re-envision the division. What's critically important, and we'll talk more about this, of the work groups in the retreat, is that much of what was discussed and identified really aligns with our overall findings. And so we're now at a place where we're moving towards developing what we're referring to as an implementation plan, but also a plan that allows for some continued work in sustainability. The ask, which I think is important because they were a critical part of the conversations that our core team had, was really, again, identifying where anti-Black racism and internalized whiteness reside relative to SCP policies, procedures, practices, with a specific focus on thinking about the strategic plan for the division, looking at the processes with regard to executive board meetings, engaging constituents, including members and non-members, as well as through observational data, as well as interviewing individuals, taking a look at policies and practices related to governance, leadership positions, appointments, et cetera, and also the practices within division. So we were able to engage and really participate in things like the rapid response protocols, which looks at, examines, and perhaps provides feedback with regard to statements that may be released by the division relative to larger issues related to social justice or just things that are happening in society on a larger scale. The ask in terms of deliverables really aligned with our overall process, which I will outline, including just collecting information, engaging individuals, and then really leading and culminating with the recommendations that we will offer.
So really one of the more important things that you all offered or the division offered in the request for proposals was identifying both pieces that would seem really important to the conversation. How is it that we identify anti-Blackness, as well as how do we think about whiteness within the context of the division? One of the pieces that we wanted to offer here, and we'll talk more about as we move forward in the conversation, is that to do this work, it's also going to be really important that the division adapt or adopt definitions and frameworks for really actually being able to define what those things mean. Right. We know that some of our colleagues, Della Mosley and her team from her dissertation has published some research, I think it was in TCP, that really talked about a model of critical consciousness for being able to acknowledge anti-Blackness. And their definition really was the system of beliefs and practices that attack, erode, and limit the humanity of Black people. They're quoting Charlene Carruthers from her writing in 2018. We also thought it was important maybe to highlight others that are out there talking about anti-Blackness. This one is specifically from a paper written about the how anti-Blackness is used to target historically Black colleges and universities. And these authors write, anti-Blackness is the longstanding and persistent cultural disregard for Black people in America. Society's preoccupation with and striving towards social Black death. They go on to add that it's the erasure of Blackness from all forms of social life, as Black people are positioned as the embodiment of problem, the persistent imagery and discourse that construct Black people and culture as devoid of value, right? And so you see here definitely the definition that Mosley et al. Use kind of aligns with this one. What we would want you to be thinking about really is how is it that, and this is a piece of what we'll try to highlight today, is how is it that we have rendered Blackness almost invisible or either invaluable within the context of the division, right? The next piece is really how is it that we're going to talk about whiteness? And really briefly, I don't want to go through all of these, but it becomes important to really acknowledge that there can be different ways of talking about whiteness. You'll see here there's a definition from a paper that Dr. Helms wrote in 2017. Some of our colleagues wrote about white supremacy and counseling psychology in 2019. And then here more, and also Dr. Helms has begun to talk about white heterosexual male privilege, excuse me, as one way of also being able to talk about whiteness. And so what we think is really important is as we move forward, and I've said this in different places, that we be thinking about this as two trains running, right, on separate tracks, but they've got to be running simultaneously. How are we talking about anti-Blackness? And how are we also talking about what is whiteness doing that is harmful to Black people, as well as how is whiteness working to perpetuate itself? Okay.
In addition to, thinking about just definitions, which has also been a theme as we have engaged folks around our findings, we thought it was really important to operate from a framework. So what's our understanding of how we would go about investigating themes related to race? And so to that end, we use the overarching framework of racial identity development as defined by Dr. Helms, including the white racial identity and people of color racial identity models. We extended our application into also thinking about racial identity social interactions, which has also been written about and articulated by Dr. Helms, as well as, I think, the organizational racial identity model, which Dr. Helms and I proposed in 2007, which extends the models even further in an effort to better understand and articulate how organizations too have racial identity structures. And so we use that framework both in our analysis, but also you'll hear in our commentary with regard to our findings. Phase one is, and we'll sort of provide you again that overview of the more specifics related to each phase, and then try to move more quickly into our findings. The caveat being there's a lot of information. So as we looked across our 3 reports that we submitted relative to each phase, it was challenging for us to really distill all of the information to sort of less than 50 minutes if we want time for engagement today. So we will leave time if there are additional questions you have with regard to things that we mentioned. Certainly feel free to ask those questions. But phase one, as I mentioned, was really what we refer to as our organizational analysis. And we did that in multiple ways, both by reviewing a lot of documentation, historical and current from the division, things from the organizational chart, looking at the strategic plan, as well as existing policies, even roles and descriptions of positions. We also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, started in the summer of 2021, meeting with the cabinet, observing meetings of the executive board. We also met over the course of the year with groups or committees as requested, tried to make ourselves available when individuals were engaging in work that predated our work with the division in an effort to, again, establish some alignment, but also to be in service to groups that had already begun the work around anti-Black racism across the division. We also engaged in sort of content analysis relative to the visual presence and the online presence of the division. And so that included an examination of the website, any social media accounts, including Twitter, as well as Instagram, I believe, and other kinds of online resources that might be webinars, et cetera, in an effort to provide feedback. Phase one also allowed us to really hone in on and to target what groups that we might want to further engage. So we had the ask with regard to really thinking about engaging constituents, but again, given the scope of the division, wanted to really pick up on any of the themes that emerged from phase one, which we'll talk about in more detail. So phase two included those community conversations, which we advertised in collaboration with the division, as well as through social media. And we offered those community conversations, again, based on racial categorization as self-identified by individuals, professional members, as well as student affiliates, and also solicited for non-members. So folks that may have been former members or thinking about membership relative to the division. We started to generate a list of individuals that we wanted to engage as well, key stakeholders on a one-to-one basis, as well as continuing some of that content analysis that was mentioned. Phase three allowed us to take the information that was generated from the listening sessions, the community conversations, and continue. So one of the interesting and noteworthy parts of our process is the more that we were able to engage with information and with individuals, it really informed or led us to additional points of inquiry. So our list in terms of individuals that we wanted to engage and ended up interviewing or meeting with in small groups expanded. And we actually slowed our process down to allow for that because we felt that some of the information emerging was really critically important. You'll note that the task of just observation and engaging by way of attending meetings and providing feedback continued over the course of the entire year. But phase three really allowed us to begin and to submit to the division some preliminary or initial recommendations, again, with the goal of really aligning with some of the work that was happening alongside our external consulting work. So we're now at the place of thinking about concrete recommendations, how to operationalize those recommendations, and how to really work with the division in an effort to offer really a roadmap beyond the work of this year that includes action steps, but also accountability. Just a couple of visuals for folks that may not have captured or noted some of the solicitations. So these were wonderful examples of some of the marketing materials generated by our junior associates who also engaged in the listening session process, either by facilitating or serving as scribes, and were very critical to phase two for us. Does people have anything to ask?
We need to figure out how to get Dr. Ennis back on the screen.
Oh, she's disappeared again.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll now move into, as we were going through and setting up slides, really rearrange things, we wanted to highlight from our perspective some themes around, themes as they pertain to Blackness, racism, and also anti-Black racism and whiteness. So if we can get Dr. Helms back, who will actually join us with some additional perspectives, then we'll be good.
She's gone.
I'm gone. I can see you.
We can hear you. We just can't
Yeah.
see you.
Oh, well, I can't see the slides, so we're pretty even.
Yeah, I think he went out of screen.
We had to go out of that. It was problematic. So let's try something else here. Well, no, I want to do that. See, I still lose her.
Can you see the slides now, Dr. Helms? That may be the most important.
I cannot tell a single thing about what's on those slides other than their pretty colors.
Right, but when we did that, we encountered problems. So we'll try it again though.
That's gonna be the only way for her to see them,
Right, okay.
is to share the screen with her, and then we'll see both.
Oops.
There you go.
And so you all can see.
I can see the slides now.
I don't know why this comes up.
Let me just close it.
Oh, this is why.
Presenter view.
Standard.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
So the first theme that that we want to discuss is just our observation based on feedback, et cetera, about the invisibility of Blackness in general. So we noted that whether it was across listening sessions or in our engagement, that it was difficult, literally difficult for folks to say Black, right, let alone Blackness or anti-Black racism. And in some cases, there was insight into that. So in some of the listening sessions, we heard participants talk about their inability or lack of confidence in understanding, defining, and being able to engage in conversation specifically as it pertains to anti-Black racism or Blackness. We also noted that given the configurations of the listening sessions, as well as ways in which we engage with folks and primed and sort of prompted them to respond to questions, oftentimes for Black folks who are engaged in conversation, their pain, in other words, the harm that has occurred, and as a consequence, the pain of Black people, was a consistent theme, be they in the listening sessions, as well as some of the one-to-one interviews, as well as our observations. It at times was also, I think, for Black folks, including the Liberation Lounge last year, what I recall after breaking individuals into those small groups and asking them to come back, for individuals who self-selected into the Black, what did we?
Black,
Small
Black.
groups?
Mhm.
Yeah, small groups. They talked about how challenging it was in the moment, given the context, interested in being there, but in the moment and sitting in the space, that it was hard to enter into the conversation because there was, again, explicit noting of just the pain of recalling or engaging in conversations about anti-Black racism. The other thing that we noted with regard to the invincibility of Blackness was the sort of obliviousness, right, to anti-Blackness by white folks, in essence. So whether it was, again, individuals who self-identified as white across the listening sessions, or also just our general sort of observations, there was a way in which, again, the explicit attempt, the explicit prompt, or explicit conversations around anti-Blackness sometimes resulted in, from our framework, disintegration, a lack of, sort of lack of general awareness, and including, again, some of the feedback that we received, it's where it's sort of difficult. So the language of anti-Black racism is new, not necessarily the language of racism. And I think we talked about this earlier during the retreat. Terminology and language certainly is important because it helps us identify an overall focus, helps us understand what it is that we're actually looking for, attempting to identify, but also address, right, and dismantle. So that was an additional theme which we can and will expound upon. But also for folks that identified as non-Black people of color, our observations were that there were substitutions or ways in which conversations that attempted to focus on, again, Blackness or anti-Black racism shifted And so terminology, right, was sort of substituted despite the prompt, right, and explicit questioning for terms like multiculturalism or diversity rather than, right, again, that explicit and initial attempt to engage in conversations really focusing on Blackness and anti-Black racism.
I just want to add one other thing, and Dr. I'm so free to jump in here if there's something that you wanted to supplement. If you take a look at points 2 and 3 there, right, the pain of Black people in addition to white obliviousness, what becomes really important too is that across the conversations that we had, whether or not they were in the listening sessions, but maybe even with some of the Black leaders or Black faculty members that we engaged, there were stories where people talked explicitly about how it is that they experienced harm, how they experience pain, how they experience being devalued, and they would be interacting with white folks, whether or not those were faculty members or leaders, and people would say that they were in pain or that something was harmful, and folks would just completely disregard that or not have any type of acknowledgement of those experiences at all, right? And so even with people being able to articulate it when they were courageous enough to do that or they were hurt enough to be able to give voice to it, it was oftentimes overlooked.
I would just add to that there a common theme was what I would call contact, which is the notion that if you don't see Blackness, if you pretend that it doesn't exist, then you don't have to deal with it. And so very often people did not see Blackness because it would create disharmony. Either it would create disharmony for themselves. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of a frequent thing. If we don't talk about it, if we pretend that it's not there, then it does not exist. Whiteness is such a big thing. A consistent theme across our interactions with Black people had to do with their sense that what was happening to them was because of white supremacy. And so we often heard people say, well, white supremacy is the cause of the racism that Black people experience. But the problem with thinking about whiteness as white supremacy is that that's such a nebulous concept. It's up in the air. What do you do about it? And so it becomes a thing that's scary because people think about white supremacy as people doing violent things to people. And in a sense, that's what it is. But since it's so big, people don't have any sense of where it is that they can enter the process to change what's happening. So it's a big, scary monster that's always in the room, but nobody talks about it. And that was mostly implicit in our interviews. And so if we wanted people to talk about it, we actually had to say something about whiteness and how they thought about that. But often people could not conceptualize that because we often think about racism as just being what happens to the survivors of racism. We don't really think about it as what do white people do that causes them to need to survive. And so that was kind of a consistent theme. How do we get people to think about both sides? How do we get people to think about, I think as Carlton often says, the train running on 2 tracks so that it's not just one thing or the other thing, but that it's both things that we are considering. Also, we found that non-Black people of color could often see anti-Black racism, but in a sense, it was a challenge to them to say anything because of their own fear that bad things might happen to them if they did. And that was perhaps not an unrealistic fear. And so the task is always, how do you tackle the big whiteness in the room when that's the structure in which we exist, unless you're able to name it. And if you can name it, that begins to give you some strategies for how you can intervene to change the situation.
Anything? Okay. We'll move on to anti-Black racism, right? So we also talked, or we were able to really take a look at the data and see that there were both implicit and explicit ways that anti-Black racism is actually supported in the context of the division. Whether or not we are talking about the documentation that we have and how it's been written, or the policies and procedures that we have that have been established, or how it is even in counseling psychology programs, there's a foundation that has really focused on how it is that we talk about white people's experiences or white heterosexual male experiences and using those as the norm. But we also see that there are ways that anti-Black racism racism manifests for students, for trainees, for faculty as well, right? With disparate funding sources, whether or not that is about students not being funded at the level that they need in order to be able to persist through the programs, or we know that there can also be disparate ways that faculty are funded or how research is regarded in the context of our training programs. It's also really important to note, and interestingly, like even having this as a part of my own experience with some faculty in our program, right? How it is that Black students come and they want to focus on Black related issues in the context of their research, and to have that sort of like diminished, or somebody actually convinces them not to pursue that as a line of research, right? That's a really important way, an explicit way that anti-Black racism functions there. But we also know, pursuant to the last slide where Dr. Helms was talking about whiteness, is that there is a recurring theme of people not taking responsibility or not being accountable for how anti-Black racism is functioning. We have here as an example, right, people thinking in terms of, well, it's really not my fault. This is just how the system is set up, which kind of goes back to the first point. It's implicit in the system, how our systems are functioning. But there's also a way of thinking about it, and we kind of talked about this in the retreat as well, that we like to think of racism as being something that's happening out there or over there in those programs, or in somewhere else other than here, right? Either within the division or in our training program or in my classroom or in my faculty meeting or in this board meeting, right? We don't want to think in terms of it actually perpetuating itself, or people perpetuating anti-Black racism in the actual local context where we find ourselves. And then what's really probably most significant here is that throughout the interviews, throughout the conversations, be they with former leaders, former editors of the counseling psychologists, with trainees, amongst colleagues, what we heard were recurrent themes of people experiencing harm, be that psychological harm or some of these other existential types of pieces that we described. And it's not just harm that's occurred in the past. We're talking about harm that is current, harm that is continuing to be perpetuated throughout the life and the day-to-day existence of programs for people, right? And even in the context of sort of like us gathering for our SCP meetings and other functions, there is anti-Black racism that's occurring. Miriam, Dr. Helms.
I would just say that sometimes the same theme occurred. It just looked different depending on who the groups were or the individuals were that we were interacting with. For instance, Black trainees talk about the lack of funding for them to pursue their graduate educations, essentially. Black faculty talk about the difficulty getting funding so that they can pursue their research, which means that when they are evaluated, then they don't get promoted because they have not done research. And so you can go through each of these and ask oneself, how does the harm appear for the social role in which these individuals find themselves? And you find the same themes, you just need to know what they look like.
I think the only thing I would add, as you were talking, Dr. Helms, is re-emphasize what Carlton noted, which is it was very explicit from folks that we engaged, the desire to really emphasize current harm and, historical, current, but the persistence. So even when we talk to folks that were later in their career stages with regard to psychology, they often reflected upon the fact that the stories that they knew of or things that they witnessed or experienced for current trainees were things that if they identified as people of color or even Black individuals, that they may have experienced in training programs, 10 years ago. So there was concern about the fact that the same types of experiences and themes persist. I think in our core team, we sort of talked about the need to move away from, and we can certainly talk more about, engage you all more in conversation about this, the need to move away from the externalizing. So there's a way in which we have intellectual conversations about, say, the needs of trainees, right? And the needs to both identify, be aware, to validate, to recognize, to do something about the harms that are occurring. But we do so in a way as if there are monsters in the room that we aren't affiliated with, or that we ourselves, right, are not affiliated with or associated with, that are engaged in such instances. And so really being able to sort of move away from the externalization felt really critically important to folks. In other words, how is this showing up here for us right now, in an effort to really identify how it is that we dismantle, disrupt, address anti-Black racism?
The last slide that we wanted to really focus on was hearing examples about how it is that there were folks in the division and probably mainly allies who were acting to resist racism. And maybe even, based upon some of the interviews we had, we want to name some folks who were doing things that we thought was really important, right? In the interview that I conducted with Dr. Annalise Singh, who is the immediate past president, right? Who we all know her presidential year really focused on liberation. And so in the context of the conversation that I had with her, there were several things that are to be highlighted. She really talked about what it was like as a trainee, not even as a faculty member, right? Not as a vice provost or whatever her role is now, right? Not as a seasoned author in the field, but as a trainee, how it is that she was really listening to, bearing witness to, and joining in with the pain of Black people, Black faculty members even, who were talking about the difficult experiences that they were having within the context of counseling psychology and why it is that they were making decisions to leave as a result of the maltreatment that they were experiencing, right? It becomes important that we think in terms of what are we doing to actually, and this goes to something that Dr. Helms said a few years ago at I think the last virtual diversity challenge in a conversation with two other scholars. She just made the observation that until white people participate in the pain of racism, that we actually won't have any change, right? So it becomes important for all of us to be thinking about how is it that we can both bear witness to, not just observe, but then join in and bear some of the brunt of the pain that people are experiencing. The other piece that Annalise talked about was how it is that she remained in proximity with those people's experiences, how she remained in relationship with those people across her development as a counseling psychologist. And so it becomes really important that we think in terms of how do we stay near the people and the pain without thinking about what is this going to cost us, or this just feels too uncomfortable for me, or there's too much dissonance around me thinking that I'm a good person and I can't remain close to this type of anti-Black racism that a person is talking about, that you actually leave, right? It becomes important that we think about how do we maintain our relationships there.
I would say maintain in authentic and genuine ways, right? So also as we think about what I saw as just sort of a societal trend, right? Especially following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, and really, as we talked about it, the emergence of explicit naming of anti-Blackness, sort of the desire to have listening sessions or to ask people to reflect upon their pain. So we also want to emphasize, as we're talking about remaining in proximity, right, is remaining in community and in relationship in meaningful and authentic ways, as opposed to that observational nature that Carlton noted.
Mm-hmm.
That can feel very burdensome.
Mm-hmm. The other piece here is the use of positionality and resources to intervene. I'll use an example from Annalise again, who was somebody who talked explicitly about wanting to make sure that there was a slate of Black people who would be running for office in the context of the upcoming election that she was overseeing as the immediate past president. And then also she made some made some statements about how it is that there was some funding that was available. So she actually invested that funding into making sure that there were resources and people to be able to help create that slate, right? So what are we doing with our positionality and our resources? Also, there were some folks who mentioned, or somebody who mentioned, Mary Wiley making the decision to appoint Black and queer folks to a number of boards and task force that were APA-wide, like really using her position to say, we need to make sure that there are people out here to be able to do some of this work, or we need to be giving people the opportunity to be in these spaces where decisions are being made so that there are Black voices there, right? And then the final one, Dr. Helms, do you want to talk about this piece about re-educating white people about racism?
Sure. I think that essentially maybe refers back to earlier slides too. Essentially, the thing we heard was that there were some white people who had begun to make efforts to deal with anti-Black racism, but they were doing it essentially without what I call a coalition. So re-educating white people means that when one sees a white person doing something that's anti-Black racism, then it's important to engage in a conversation with that person to say, this is not how it should be done. But I also want to say that re-education has to do with taking small bites of the monster. So some people think that they have to solve all of racism at once. But if each white person took a small bite, that is, told one white person in their life, even if it's themselves, that this is an anti-Black racist thing that you did, then they've essentially made a change. And if enough people do that, then in fact, resisting Blackness would become a thing that people did regularly. And who knows, maybe I'll be optimistic, 20 or 30 years, we might not have to have this conversation again if we're around to have this conversation. So I guess the end thing is think about it as not solving all of the problems of racism, but solving something. And if we can solve something, then that helps to change the system.
So, we knew that we had limited time and we wanted to give a really broad overview, and also with the knowledge that we have a final report to submit with regards to the implementation plan based on the recommendations that we gathered from folks, in addition to the observations that we were making along the way. What we wanted to be able to do in giving that high level overview was also engage you in any questions that you might have, right? We also know that there's plenty of other information that we could talk about. So there could be other examples that could manifest here in this conversation. But what questions, what curiosities do you have about this particular, this effort here that we've been talking about? I'm going to bring you the mic so you can speak into it.
Oh, I don't know how to do this. So thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to touch on something that you had mentioned about how, and I've said this myself around the conversation of racism, is that our favorite thing to do is to say there's racism out there. And we tend to focus on what I always kind of refer to as like the layups of racism, like the very outright, like violent racism, the protests. I mean, not like the Charlottesville, the police brutality. And when, you bring up the question of like, there's racism happening here. I'm committing anti-Black racism. We are committing anti-Black racism, but there's almost like a lack of acknowledgement of how if it's not outwardly violent, it's not harmful. And like, how do we kind of push to a change and say, it's great to condemn police brutality and other very violently racist things, but like, what else, right? Like, I need you to recognize that other things that are, anti-Black rape, like part of anti-Black racism is also harmful. And I think specifically in terms of like white people recognizing it as harmful.
And Dr. Helms, feel free to chime in. As you were asking the question, a few things came to mind from our conversations, as well as just the work that we do in this space. We intentionally, I think, sort of modeled our presentation in an effort to focus on anti-Black racism. But what I think we can offer, and I would say even from my own experiences in terms of learning, really aligns with the point of kind of re-educating folks. There are a couple of things that I often say, right? As we have conversations about anti-Black racism, for me, I always go back to, do people understand the concepts, right, of race? Do you understand racism? Because I often find that we're not moving away from anti-Black racism, but there are ways in which we tend to focus yes, the explicit, right? And in many ways, the most what people might deem significant or extreme examples, but we also tend to focus on interpersonal racism. And maybe, right, as we talk about pain and harm, there's an emphasis on intra, right, sort of personal examples of racism. And while we made mention, I think that conversations that explicitly, right, use the full definition of racism that includes, right, institutional systemic racism is one way in our own conversations and education that we can hold ourselves accountable, right, to naming and understanding the connections. That's one thing that I mentioned, I think, in our team, is that it's like we aren't connecting the dots, right? And there's a way in which when we intellectualize and we're not, affectively connected, that can happen. But I think that's also one thing that may factor into, right, the tendency to look at the thing that makes the news, right? Sort of media headlines. And that tends to be both interpersonal as well as, significant. Certainly what we heard from folks and in our conversations is, how are policies and, sort of systemic practices also, one thing we didn't mention, impacting, our understanding of conversations, for example, that talk about, the fact that for people of color, for Black folks, what are the roles that they may take, right, as counseling psychologists, as practitioners. So what does that mean as we have conversations about the emphasis on academia and academics, across the division. And so how do, just coming to APA, I think this actually emerged as a point of conversation for a practitioner who may want to be involved in leadership. Right. It requires having, a day, et cetera, which may, for a practitioner, right, take away from income and revenue. So how are we really connecting the dots as opposed to having these bullet point kind of conversations and really capturing, right, how racism functions and using a lens then of anti-Black racism, right, to really better understand so that we can, again, identify where our focus needs to be and how it is that we disrupt those patterns.
I would just add to that for me, I think it's about making connections. It's very difficult for people to think about Black people as people.
Mhm.
And so as psychologists, there are a number of situations where we deal with oppression that is not necessarily violent. We deal with psychological oppression. Think about, for instance, child abuse or domestic violence. Each of those things has an intrapersonal element. So how the people involved in the situation think about violence. It also has a interpersonal, so the interaction among people that contributes to the psychological dimensions. And then there are systemic levels. What policies are in place to make sure that that violence doesn't keep happening to the child or the woman or the man, whoever is the victim of the violence. And so if we can begin to make associations between things that are familiar to ourselves, so to help us understand what it means to be a Black person in an oppressive system, and then educate white people about that, help them to see it too, other white people, then I think we begin to, again, using the analogy of taking little bites out of the monster, beginning to change the way the system functions.
I would just add, I was going to start where Dr. Helm said, that at the heart of anti-Blackness is not seeing Black people as human, right? Even if I just go back to one of the stories that I heard, a Black woman counseling psychologist talking to a senior a senior white woman counseling psychologist and saying something that you did right. And the white woman looking at the Black woman and saying, but you weren't crying, right? But the Black woman saying, but you hurt me. And so there's just not any real regard for people's experiences, right? And what we know is that, also at the heart of anti-Blackness is that Black people are cast as either subhuman or superhuman, but never just human, right? And so we have to really contend with that. One of the pieces that came, as we were preparing for this and talking about the pieces that we wanted to present today, even if we go back to the observation that even people of color, Black people, are talking about white supremacy as opposed to talking about racism, or talking about anti-Black racism, or talking about what white people have done as harmful to them. What becomes really important is that we can name how it's occurring, right? And so one of the recommendations that somebody made was, it might be really important for the executive board to go through some training around white racial identity development, right? So that folks can actually begin to understand how it's manifesting, give them some language for being able to name what some of the actions or behaviors or speech that's occurring. Because to your point, there are no police, right, in the context of the e-board, or people are not necessarily being physically hit, right? And so some of those things that we think of as being anti-Black racism are not manifesting there, but we have to figure out the language for how it is manifesting.
Thank you so much for this. This was really inspiring, and I'm glad that y'all are involved in this effort. My question is, I don't know, I feel like something that has been coming up a lot in conversations that I'm having, whether, especially with white folks, but even non-Black people of color, is alliance to Black people feeling performative and feeling not genuine. And I'm wondering, and I think that can be something that people are afraid of, but then also others are accusing people of being performative. And so I'm wondering if that came up at all in your work as you were digging into this. And I don't know, because I think that that's something that I've noticed a lot, is people saying, oh, that they're doing the things that you're saying, right? Whether it's a white person or a non-Black person of color, they're doing the things that you're suggesting, the recommendations, but then they're being called performative. And so I'm wondering just your thoughts on that.
Dr. Helms, do you want to start?
I actually don't quite know what that means, but let me give it a try. in identity theory, I talk about how breaking the rules gets you punished. And it gets you punished by people for different reasons. White people do it because what you're doing is you're threatening their power. And so the way they kind of try to keep you from threatening their power is by discounting what you're doing, discarding you, saying what you're doing is not of value. And so in that case, one really has to work on building one's own racial self-esteem. And you do that by building coalitions, particularly of other white people who can help you deal with it. Because ultimately, you're the person who has to decide whether what you're doing is real or not. People of color, particularly Black people, may not trust a white person who seems to be doing the right things because white people don't typically do the right things. I'm sorry to say, but that's the case. So the cost for that is that you keep trying, and if you keep trying and continue to do things that show that you're willing to fight for giving up racism against Black people, even when it hurts you, then you begin to gain that trust, and then you become what I call more than an ally. You become a collaborator. And so that's what you want to do. You have to be able to define what it is that you want to do, what defines you. And then other people can't do that for you.
I would say from the report, from the work that we've done, to your point, Kara, is what emerged was students and mostly trainees talking about how it is that they come to, well, let me back up. Well, no, that's right. I think that trainees would identify our programs as performative, right? Naming that we have these values around social justice, naming that we have these values around inclusion, naming that we have values around racial equity or racial equality. And then when they get into the programs, they not only are running into curriculum that is not necessarily consistent with those values, but they also treat it in ways, right, whether or not it's about people pathologizing them or calling them unprofessional for how they behave or deriding their research ideas, right? There are ways that people continue to experience it. And what I think that a piece that comes through in the data is that it's actually doubly disappointing to enter into a program that said it was this one thing, and you get in, you experience it as being something totally different. And so that contributes to sort of to Dr. Helms's point, mistrust in the programs, right? And people are, even if we talk about these notions of equality and inclusion and all those wonderful words, when people get hurt or people get harmed in the program, nothing happens. And not only do we see nothing happening, but the people who are the harm doers actually get promoted or elevated, right? Either within the department or across the division. And that too feels really like we're just performing. We're not really being accountable to our values.
The other way I would say that showed up.
She was starting.
I was just going to follow up quickly on what Carlton said, which is, I think actually it might be really useful to ask the person who's accusing one of being performative what they mean. And in fact, maybe you or the program or whoever is performative. And if you have that information, then you know what to do in order to not be.
What I was going to add, in addition to, I think, Carlton's example, the topic around whether it's performative or sort of this idea of how are we truly committing to identifying and addressing anti-Black racism really emerged in response to questions we asked in the listening sessions about the division, right, about the society, about SCP. So we had across all listening sessions and configurations, individuals who talked about, questioned what Carlton just provided relative to the division. In other words, how committed is SCP, right? And even though that there are values related to counseling psychology that sort of say certain things, and ideally, right, the division is more committed to social justice, which should include anti-Black racism. There were a lot of questions, observations, perceptions from folks who wondered, right, in what ways might the inaction across the division feel or be performative. And that was something that you can certainly see in the report, but sort of emerged. I'm thinking about our semi-structured protocol when we just sort of asked in general, starting out sort of about the strengths of the division, so what people appreciated, and then sort of drilled down into thinking about anti-Black racism. But that was a resounding theme as people grappled with, well, what is anti-Black racism? How is the division supporting knowledge, right, relative to that, and awareness that can lead to action? But also, the division is saying that they're committed to this now, and we've seen some work. Will this continue? So I think the question you pose is a really good one. It's one that's in the forefront of the minds of the folks that certainly we engaged.
There is also the question that comes up in the report about the difference between leadership and the rest of SCP. And so people will say, or do say, for instance, maybe the leadership thinks that focusing on anti-Black racism is a good thing, but what is the leadership doing to bring other people along? How do other people feel about that mission? Because ultimately how the rest of the membership feels is going to influence what can be accomplished with respect to overcoming anti-Black racism.
Any other, maybe time for one more question, if somebody has one? Catherine.
Yeah, so some of the folks I've been in conversation with the last year have a similar sense of mistrust. We're really good at getting in groups and talking about ideas and not really doing any of them. And I was really curious, Dr. Helms, about your comment about white people sometimes trying to do the right thing, but not doing the work in coalition. So I have this sense of a tension between acting quickly enough, but not acting alone. And, how do you see SCP going forward in a way that's in coalition and has the members along with it, but is actually doing something and making the change as well?
Well, sometimes coalition comes after the fact. So in effect, if you are present for something that you need to react to right away, you react to it. But recognizing that when you react to something, you are breaking the rules and you may encounter pushback from the group that you are working with, which is why I think you always need to begin to build a support group that you can turn to and say, this event happened, this is how I feel, what should I do next? So that it isn't really you acting alone, although you may be alone in the moment, you don't have to be alone all the time. And so if I were to give you, if you're interested in working on anti-Black racism, if I were to give you advice, I'd say start building a coalition of people, even if they're spread all over the country, a coalition of people who you can call on the phone and say, this happened, what do we need to do in order to make a difference with respect to that whatever happened.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is just going back to one of the points that we talked about earlier, which is about participating in or joining in with the pain, right, that is being experienced. Oftentimes, what I observe is that white folks who are witnessing anti-Black racism, they want to quickly move into action mode as a way of doing something rather than taking some time to understand exactly what the harm or what the pain is, and also creating some space to be able to understand exactly what it means for them, right? As white folks, what is my emotional experience of this, right? But oftentimes the move is to not experience any of that. So we're going to go out and do something that will actually be misinformed because we haven't taken the time to really feel what has occurred or feel the impact of what has occurred.
I was thinking the same thing. And also, go ahead, Dr. Holmes.
I was just going to say that actually feeling something is doing something. Being able to show that you actually feel bad about the situation, for example, is doing something. Because one of the comments that we heard frequently is, these bad things are happening to me and the white people in the environment are happy. They don't see it, they don't feel it. And I think you have to connect with your feelings. And so a part of recognizing Black people as human is being able to at least ask yourself, how would I feel if this thing happened to me that just happened to the person that I am interacting with?
Yeah, I think what I was thinking, sort of process sometimes in the moment. But what I was thinking is that I certainly respect the desire to want to do something and to act. And I think the question I often have is, what are we acting towards? Like what's, and so there's not the time, both the time to sort of reflect and to understand. There's a tension sometimes between the inaction, right, and the action. And so having a coalition to hold yourselves accountable and ensure that you are doing something, but not acting so quickly that not done your due diligence to understand, right, the issue, to understand the harm, because that gives you information about what the potential action might be. So then you have folks acting and actually potentially running the risk of committing more harm because the time hasn't been taken. So for me, even amongst a team, I think we hold ourselves accountable in sort of how are we understanding this, but how are we also, right, working towards action and recognizing, naming, right, that there may be some tension there, but that's why the coalition is actually critically important, because you have folks that have strengths in particular areas, but together you sort of build or think about the roadmap.
So maybe we should wrap up. I think I forgot to put in the last slide just with our parting thoughts. I don't know. Dr. Helms, I don't know if you want to close us out by talking, or Miriam, close us out by talking about the emotional triggers piece that we were kind of putting on the table there as we were wrapping up our conversation.
Well, in some sense, I think we were having that conversation, recognizing that when you break the socialization rules, when you try to break a system that's been in place for however long the system has been in place, people push back because it means that they see themselves as having to lose something without gaining something in return. I should say white people push back because they're losing something as opposed to seeing themselves as gaining something in return. So a part of the work one needs to do for oneself, actually, regardless of race, is to figure out what you have to gain by changing racism, by ending racism, and then communicating, sharing that with the other people with whom you engage. And you can't do this work unless you have emotions, and unless you are willing to show those emotions and share those emotions with someone someone at least that you trust, but also people who are not used to seeing you have emotions about their life experiences. If you do that, even if it's not perfect, you've accomplished something.
Mm-hmm. The last thing I'll say is I think that through the conversations that we were having, one of the recurrent themes, and I kind of already addressed it, but I think this is my parting thought, is we heard examples of how it is that there were white folks in the division who had observed other white people being harmful. And the white people who were observing and had knowledge of other white people being harmful, not doing anything, right? And so what that really creates is a culture of mistrust, a culture of disappointment. It just facilitates harm. And what we're doing is really setting up a revolving door for Black people to leave the division. And so if in fact we want to see some change, there is going to have to be some accountability on the part of white people who have the skills to be able to observe and decipher, right, how anti-Black racism is occurring. If you are seeing it, you've actually got to act. Otherwise, you are really just contributing to the mistrust that is present in the division.
I'll close by just a couple of things that come to mind for me especially in terms of moving forward. It goes back to the point about what it takes to do this work. I think we do have information that we sometimes in the moment, it can be really hard to hold on to, which is why coalitions are so important as reminders. So there are things and frameworks, right, that allow us to really anticipate what may happen when we engage in the work, right? That certainly everyone's not going to be on the same page. If we have, as Carlton, Dr. Helms, and myself often engage in conversations about, when this happens, right? As we think about making a systemic change, folks are going to be affected. What might we anticipate? You can't predict everything, but I think there's a way in which sort of reminding ourselves about what it is that we do know becomes the ways in which we sort of decide how we move forward, right? Can be preventative. And sometimes that gets lost again, and that idea of connecting the dots. Like we read information, we take it in, we can even present on it, but in what ways are we actually living and embodying what it is that we know? So whether that's using the white racial identity, sort of framework as a blueprint for understanding how we engage in the re-education of white folks, right? Whether that's providing resources for Black folks across the division that helps us not just understand, right, or identify anti-Black racism, but also sort of supports and provides resources, right, as being beneficial to their well-being. So how are we taking the information that we actually do have, as opposed to sometimes moving in the direction of, yes, we need to always, be accountable and collect more information and make sure that we are connected to the issues, but there are ways in which we sort of can perpetuate that process without, I think, any intentionality. I would say those are our sort of in the moment closing comments, but certainly we welcome any additional thoughts that folks have. The last thing that I will actually say, so the benefit, I think, for Carlton, myself, and Dr. Helms is, while our formal work in terms of what we were tasked to do may end, we are still very much so, right, a part of the division and in service to the division. So we don't disappear. We are happy to be accountability partners. But I think in our interview, I always say this, certainly as a consultant, it is not the goal, right, that for year upon year upon year, right, you have to engage the work of an external consultant, versus how do we also take some of the processes that our team engaged in to ensure accountability? We sat in EB meetings, for example, and engaged in observations. How can we engage in the training, right? Identify sort of roles for folks in those settings to hold individuals accountable, right? Versus relying just on external eyes, right, in the moment. So I also want and sort of challenge across the division for us to think about what it is that we certainly unearthed, but what are the processes that we may have engaged that would be beneficial to really integrate into, right, the day-to-day practices of the division across the division. You're welcome. I think Roman has a hand up. Oh, is he clapping? Oh, I can't see. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Are you coming up, Amy? Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you tomorrow at the business meeting, presidential talk, and the social. So thank you, everyone, for coming on a Friday evening. Go enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you to this amazing team.